Hi everyone, I'm Zilla Blitz, and today we'll be exploring Maida 1806, the new two-player war game from Form Square Games and designed by Andrew Roarke. This is game 2 in the Limits of Glory series, which explores Napoleonic combat with some new, fresh mechanics. Maida 1806 refers to the battle on July 4th, 1806, between a British expeditionary force and French forces outside the town of Maida, Italy. The game, however, simulates the entire campaign surrounding this battle. Basically, French forces will invade the Kingdom of Naples and attempt to crush the resistance. With an invasion of Sicily imminent, the British deploy an expeditionary force to help thwart the French plans. Historically, the campaign culminated in the British defeating the French at Maida, forcing the French to withdraw and foiling the invasion of Sicily. How this campaign plays out in the game is up to us. So here's Maida 1806 spread out in front of us, and let's do a quick overview. This is a two-player game where one player takes charge of the Neopolitan forces with their largely British allies, and the other player controls the French. And gameplay is listed at 1.5 hours to 3 hours. And historically, it's important to note that the game is not singularly about the Battle of Maida, but represents the entire months-long campaign, starting roughly with the French invading Naples, the British expeditionary force arriving, and then continuing through until one side or the other is defeated. Turn length is abstracted within that framework of the full campaign. Units consist of currency-like elements, essentially strength points, with each element representing about 1,000 men. Let's next do a high-level overview of the mechanics in Maida 1806. So the map is an area control map, and interestingly, each area has what's called a space value on it, from 1 to 4, which signifies how easy or hard it is for forces to take actions like movement in those areas. And we'll take a closer look at how this works when we look at the map. The game models both land and naval units. Leaders are a huge part of gameplay, and connected to that is the leader glory, which is a core mechanic in this Limits of Glory system. Glory represents a combination of a leader's skill and historical luck, and is expended by leaders throughout the game to influence a wide range of actions. Deciding when and how to spend your leader's glory for re-rolling dice is key to success in all the games of this series. Commander seniority, casualties, and exhaustion are also modeled in the game. Momentum is a mechanic in the game that correlates with unit activations and is expended to allow for players to act in a turn. Combat uses dice rolling, force strength, and force quality to determine combat results. The game has two larger phases: an initial invasion phase, which is all the activity before the French arrive, and then the meat of the game, which is the conquest phase, which simulates action once the French invasion has started. Sieges are modeled in the game, as they were in the historical campaign, and uprisings can also occur. One of my favorite mechanics in this series is the very cool event clock, which uses a dice-based system to sequence events in roughly a historical order, but one that can play out differently in each game. This feature, I think, adds a lot to the game's replayability. Victory is determined by a combination of conditions and victory points. We'll talk more on these as we look at the map. Let's take a look at the rulebook, which weighs in at 36 pages. Having said that, the text is rather large and readable, and there's artwork scattered about that lessen the page count of the actual content. Overall, the thing that I think strikes me the most about this is the creativity behind a lot of these rules. There's just a lot of fun twists that abound in this game and give the entire game a fresh and original feel. The layout, clean, easy to read. There's a handful of supplemental graphics and examples to help with learning, although at times I find myself wishing for a few more examples. Maybe a kind of an example of play too would be nice to have in here too. Complexity-wise, I'll give this game a 3.5 out of 10. The game isn't overly complex, and I'm tempted to give it a 3 out of 10, but there's enough novelty here in the mechanics that I think it'll take experienced gamers a bit of time to sort out the newness. Solitaire-wise, I'll guess this is going to be about a 6 out of 10. There doesn't appear to be anything about hidden information, and there are no cards in the game, so all the information is in front of the player. So while there is no nod to playing Solitaire or any special bots or rules or guidance for Solitaire, I think gamers will have little trouble playing a solo game where they control both sides to the best of their ability. The game now has one main scenario, and there are no optional rules or variants involved. However, given the variety of ways the event clock can unfold, I think there'll be a good bit of variety in how each game plays out. So I think there is an ample amount of replayability in this game. Let's explore the counters a bit, which give us some more insight into how the game will play. There are 4 sheets in all, and they're printed on a single side. For military units, we've got leaders. Here's a couple up here. And land units over here. And these consist mostly of infantry, but there are some cavalry and cannon mixed in. And then we have naval units. These forces have strength values on them and function in a currency-like manner. So if you lose 2 strength points from a 5 strength infantry unit, you'd replace it with an equivalent of 3 strength points. For leaders, there are 2 identical counters for each leader, one that represents the leader on the game map, and the other goes on the numerical track on the map to represent the leader's glory. And that glory, again, is then expended and depleted largely for dice rolls as the campaign wears on. For nationalities, we've got the French in blue and the British here on sheet 4 in red, and then the Neopolitans are in green, so here they are on the 3rd sheet here. We also have some Calabrian guerrillas in gray that can rise up in rebellion. They're down here. And then there is a small contingent of Russians that are over here on the 1st counter sheet here. There are also some larger square event markers which represent a 2nd level of event that can happen on the event clock. And we'll talk more about how these work when we look at the event clock itself. Lastly, there are a handful of tracking markers for things like victory points and momentum and other game functions. Let's move on now to the player aids and start with the coolest of them all, which is the event clock. This is the same sort of mechanic used in Bonaparte's Eastern Empire, the first game in the series, and it is clever as clever can be. Let's explore how it works. So when the game starts out, there is a 1 die marker that goes here on this first spot. And then each turn starts with the roll with 1 die for an event. So if we were to roll a 5, we would execute this event and then play the turn. However, most of the events are one-time events. So after this event is executed, you place the 2nd event of the same number on the game clock. So if we had already rolled this 5 here, we would then take this next 5, which is a completely different event, and drop it on top of the previous one. That means the next time you roll a 5, the new event is executed. Now, some of these events, like this 2nd level event, will ask you then to follow that up with a roll of 2 dice. And so you add the 2nd die marker here, which means from then on in the point in the game, you're going to be rolling 2 dice and using events from this 1st and 2nd column. So that means as the game goes on, you're driving farther down the event clock, picking up the 2nd row and then 3rd row, and then eventually you get to 4 dice, and things that trigger the end state game can happen. This is, I think, a fantastically clever way to spawn a variety in every playthrough, and at the same time trigger events in a logical fashion. Chef's kiss for this one. I really like it. The combat table, likewise, is very clever. The numbers across the top represent the combat value of the force in battle, which represents the strength points of the units times a modifier depending upon the type of unit. You then cross-reference that with the nationality row and get to end up on a box here. So for example, say if we had 8 combat factors and they were French, the French marker would go here. If we had, say, 15 British markers, the British, in a mostly British dominated force, the marker would go here. Now, each side then rolls 4 dice and totals them up. You need to get the top number at the box here in order to do any damage, or greater, in order to do any damage at all. And then you do strength point damage depending upon the die rolls, 5s and 6s down in here. Keep in mind that it's here that commanders will be burning up glory to change dice rolls for both themselves and their enemies. So it's a very clever system that brings into play leader effectiveness, unit strength, and unit quality. Lastly, we have the orders of battles for both sides. This is important as this often dictates which commander is in charge of the units in combat and how you can split units and forces off as you move around in the campaign. We've got some bits and bobs in the game as well. We've got the 8 dice, which again are used for combat and for movement and action success. Then we've got 10 tokens. These 2 we use to track the correct box on the combat table. And these other 8 are optional tokens that can be used instead of the momentum tracking counters that you'd be placing on the map. So you can use whichever one you like. Lastly, the map. Now this is a 23.5 inch by 16.5 inch mounted map, and we can see the various areas on the map with north mostly here to our left. We've got Naples right here, and then Sicily down here at the bottom. To the right, we have the track for keeping track of victory points and leader glory levels. This is probably a good time to talk about the game's art style, which is a period reflective, somewhat cartoonish element to it that I must admit has grown on to me as I explore the game and games in the series more. I'm not sure if it's my favorite art style for a war game, but I know many people like it, and I'm also happy to see games in our hobby take us in new directions. I'd like for a moment to talk about the numbers on the map, which represent the number of dice you throw to take an action there. So for example, say you have forces in Strigoli and you want to move them out of it here. Now we can see that this has the number 2 on the space here. You must roll 2 dice to see if you're successful. And to succeed, you need to roll a 5 or a 6 on any one of those 2 dice. If you get one, everything in the space can move. And if you fail, you then have the choice to expend the leader glory of a leader in that space to try to re-roll to be successful. Eventually, after kind of moving on and going through your options, you'll run out of options, and then you place a momentum marker in that space, indicating the end of your particular activation. This is a clever way to represent difficult terrain and uncertain movement options. Instead of knowing exactly how far a force can move in an activation, you just don't know. Or you might be able to succeed in the march only at the expense of burning through your leader's combat effectiveness. Clever. Lastly, let's talk about victory, which hinges on a number of factors. The French win outright if they control the city of Gaeta and have more victory points than the Allies at the end of any turn. Victory points are awarded for the control of built-up areas in the game, and each area has a couple of point values attached to it, one for the French, and one for the Allies. The Allies win immediately if they have a victory point total of 24 at the end of any turn where 4 dice were used on the event clock, which as we saw would signify that the campaign has drawn on quite long to get that far that you're using 4 dice for your event rolls. Additionally, there is a late game event that triggers where Napoleon calls off the invasion. If that happens before either side wins outright, the player with the most victory points wins a partial victory. In those circumstances, if the victory point total is tied, whoever controls the city of Gaeta wins the campaign. Well, there you have it, a look at the components and mechanics in Maida 1806. Let me know what you think. I'm very impressed with how this series is progressing and the cleverness of this system. Now in a short bit, I'll be creating an overview of Santa Maura and Capri, the third game in the series, which is already out and consists of 2 smaller, shorter games in one box. When that video is ready, I'll add a link to it here. Thanks so much for watching. Have a great day.